This video is sponsored by Squarespace. The many attempts at a CGI Arnold Schwarzenegger from across the years provide the perfect example of not only the evolution of the modern Terminator franchise, because, nothing captures the essence of it better than constantly resurrecting the same thing over and over again, but it also provides a great example of the evolution of both CGI technology itself and, more importantly, how that technology was implemented. Because you'd think these Arnolds got more and more realistic simply due to CGI technology getting better. And whilst this certainly is a massive factor, I believe it was also down to how that technology was used and how the lessons learned from each attempt fueled this progress towards perfection. And so that's why we're going to break down each of these attempts to explore why 2 of these scenes worked, whereas 1 just missed the mark, in addition to uncovering how this scene from Terminator Genisys actually has way more CGI than you'd ever expect, all whilst also revealing how one prop from Terminator 1 was basically the entire reason that any of this was possible. So to discuss this and more, completely run out of ideas, and then constantly try to resurrect the youthful corpse of the world's second most famous Austrian, as we dive into the many attempts at creating a CGI Arnold Schwarzenegger. So let's start with Terminator Salvation.
What day is it? What year?
2018.
What happened here?
Judgment Day happened.
Because the CGI Arnold in this film gets a lot of criticism for being bad, and is often held up as one of those poster boys of the uncanny valley, which is that phenomenon where a closer a CGI character gets towards being photorealistic, the more our brains begin to reject them, as they feel real, but not real enough, making some primal part of your brain question what it's looking at, and therefore the whole thing just feels slightly uncomfortable. And so this is a problem that plagues a lot of CGI characters. But you know what? Considering everything they were up against making this guy, I genuinely feel like it's actually quite impressive that he even looks this good, because it turns out that the original plan was to never even have a CGI Arnold in this film, because Arnold Schwarzenegger actually had nothing to do with this project, and this presumably was some kind of attempt to have this film stand apart from previous films like Terminator 3, which got criticized for being too similar to its predecessors. And so instead, the original plan was just to show this muscular robot occluded by shadow, just to basically give the implication that this was an Arnold style robot, and then right before the audience saw his face, John Connor would blow it off to reveal its T-800 skeleton on the inside, circumventing the entire issue as to whether it's Arnold or not. But then, in the middle of shooting, this film's director, McG, spoke with some fans at a comic book event and found out that they all wanted to see Arnold in this film somehow, which resulted in the plans suddenly changing to include him, meaning that now the guy they had on set playing the shadowy body of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Roland Kickinger, who actually looked quite a bit like a young Arnold and had even portrayed him in the biopic See Arnold Run, was now going to have his head completely digitally replaced with Schwarzenegger's. And looking at this behind the scenes footage of Roland, I find it really funny that for some reason they tried to cover up his face as much as possible, because presumably that would break the whole illusion, I guess, that they got Arnold Schwarzenegger for this film. But either way, I love it because it just reminds me of that neighbor from Home Improvement. But yeah, anyway, this decision happening right in the middle of shooting was probably already a bit of a problem, because now you can't do all of the typical preparations that you would do for such an effect, like the literal months and months of research and development that you need. And you can kind of tell from the film's visual effects supervisor, Ben Snow's reaction, that he wasn't really too enthusiastic about this.
Okay, couple of shadowy shots, we want to get the hint that it's Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then we start filming it, and McGee's like, okay, he starts going in for close-ups on the guy that's playing the body of the T-800 and says, Ben, I really want to challenge you with this. We're going to be right in the face. You guys are going to have to bring your best game for this. We're like, okay, this isn't what we signed on for, but it's fantastically exciting. So yeah, okay.
Fantastically exciting, so yeah, okay.
And so he's probably being quite diplomatic there and just laughing off something that was this massive source of stress. What then makes all of this even worse is that fact that Arnold was never actually attached to this film. Because if you look at similar digital characters at the time, like Clue from Tron Legacy, you can see that not only were they able to prepare and have all of these special cameras and tracking markers and just all of this stuff that they don't seem to to have on Terminator Salvation, but also they had the original actor Jeff Bridges there to provide a baseline facial performance in addition to minute reference of how his face was built and how his different muscles move as he emotes, and just basically providing all of that real detail that you need to generate a digital clone of someone. And so here, without Arnold, they didn't have access to any of that. And so instead, all they had for reference as to how to digitally rebuild his face and muscles was previous young Arnold footage which showed how his face moves, and this prop mold of his head that was made for the first Terminator film, and therefore gave them some kind of reference as to how his head was built all the way back in 1985. Which sounds great, but in reality, neither of which were particularly ideal, because neither of which captured those subtle details that Arnold Schwarzenegger brought to the Terminator. Like, for example, how he was always clenching his jaw to give it this stiff, mechanical look. And so, all of this subtle stuff had to be worked in by the visual effects team by hand. But then, beyond this, there was also the legality of including Arnold Schwarzenegger's digital likeness in this film, because without his permission, you can't just CGI him into your movie.
Hi, I'm Saul Goodman. Did you know that you have rights?
And so because of this, the visual effects team actually had to work on both the CGI Arnold plan and the original occluded in shadow plan at the same time, because they needed that original plan as a backup just in case Arnold said no. And so in the end, they only actually got the go-ahead from Arnold around a few weeks before this film was released.
Senior Chang, can you do something about this? I'll allow it.
Meaning that basically the entire time they were working on this, their resources were constantly getting split in half between these two plans. And so when you consider all of that with the fact that they only really had 6 months to do this effect, I think this Arnold is actually a ridiculously impressive achievement and is ridiculously underrated. But yeah, I'd say his key flaw is that he's definitely missing that subtle level of detail that would help him leave the uncanny valley. Which, to explore this level of detail, actually brings us to the young Arnold scene from Terminator Genisys, where old Arnold Schwarzenegger from one time fights young Arnold Schwarzenegger from Terminator 1, and to be honest, I don't really get it, but I like the visual effects though. But before we get to that, I wanted to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. Because I've been using Squarespace for my website for some time now, and I am continuously shocked by just how much time and effort and stress it saved me, as I'm pretty new to having a website, and so I honestly find the whole technical back end of it really intimidating. And so this meant that whilst I really enjoyed setting up the website's visual elements, you know, like easily dragging and dropping in pictures and letting their AI generate the backbone of what I wanted to do, I was always just a little bit scared to set up things like the metadata and the search engine optimization and just all of that stuff you need to appear correctly on things like Google. Because even though people kept telling me to do it, I just barely knew what any of that meant. And so when I finally got around to doing this, I was just really dreading it because A, I didn't want to break my website by doing something wrong, and B, I just didn't want to put the work in to learn how to do it and how to optimize everything correctly and just all of that stuff. And so when I finally did set this up, I was both incredibly surprised and incredibly relieved by just how easy Squarespace had made this process, because they gave me a full report of everything that was wrong, and within just a few clicks, AI had resolved literally all of the issues for me, and I was free to just go about the rest of my day happily. And so this is just one of many examples of Squarespace making it ridiculously easy for anyone to make a great website. So head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/CGY to save 10% on your first purchase of a website or domain. And with that, now back to the video and back to the amazing details of the CGI Arnold from Genisys. Because not only is this sequence absolutely loaded with invisible CGI to make this possible, which is something we'll get to in just a minute, it also achieved, I think for the very first time in filmmaking history, an incredibly detailed and fully photorealistic CGI human character, and managed to keep this character looking very good for very long stretches of time, even though the real actor is right there next to him, and all whilst under the extremely restrictive conditions of matching this scene up to the exact events of the first Terminator film. So how did they do it, and how did they get this character out of the uncanny valley? Well, similar to Salvation, the original plan was to just keep it simple and just CGI young Arnold's head onto bodybuilder Bret Hazard's body. But because this film had this goal of faithfully recreating the exact events of Terminator 1, the visual effects team found that the only way they could make this concept work would be to do full replacements of Bret in almost all of these shots, which, believe it or not, turned out to be an absolute nightmare. Because by having to exactly match that original footage, any cutting of corners, like changing the scene's lighting to hide your CGI imperfections under some shadows, or occluding the character with some smoky ambience like films like to do to help with realism, would change the scene and therefore ruin that goal of being faithful, which is something that Arnold knows a lot about. And so, to make this one-to-one match even remotely possible, the poor team at NPC had to use absolutely everything available to them. Most notably of which was that, this time around, they actually had Arnold Schwarzenegger available to them. And so, not only was he able to provide the performance for the young Terminator, but he could also have his face be digitally scanned, and was therefore also able to provide all of those subtle real-world details that we mentioned earlier. However, there was the problem that Arnold is just a lot older now, and so all of this modern facial data that they captured from him was actually very slightly different to how his 1984 face would have behaved, meaning that now the poor visual effects team still had to go through and reference that same old footage from back in the day and use that to meticulously inject Arnold's former youthfulness back into the character once again. And so whilst, yeah, this alone probably did give them a massive leg up over what they created in Salvation, because at least there's something real from Arnold here, because this wasn't just a perfect copy and paste of the old Arnold onto the young one, I believe the real realism of this character was actually much more down to three very specific factors. And the first of those factors was how they set up this insanely believable CGI skin. Because perhaps the most common criticism of CGI skin is that it looks too dead and too rubbery, and that's oftentimes because it's lacking that subtle translucent factor that skin has, where in short, skin looks the way it does because light hits it, penetrates it, bounces around a whole bunch inside, and then just bounces out again, causing that milky feeling in lighter skin as the light is diffusing through all of this tissue and blood and stuff under the surface. And so whilst nowadays CGI technology can actually do this process quite well, but also quite slowly, this film took it to the next level and actually figured out the blood that should be flowing underneath Arnold's skin, meaning that now when the light diffuses through his skin, you actually get that absurdly subtle variation in tone that you also see in real life, causing him to, kind of ironically, feel like he's actually alive. And so, speaking of this character feeling alive, this brings me to the second major trick that they used, and that was getting Arnold Schwarzenegger's muscles to work correctly. Because even though this stand-in actor does have a pretty crazy physique, it wasn't Arnold Schwarzenegger's physique that is so iconic to the look of the character of the Terminator. And so to digitally manifest this as well, the visual effects team had to sit down and basically completely rework their CGI muscle pipeline so that all of this character's muscles would operate exactly like Mr. Olympia's would, which is actually just quite tragically funny to think about, because sadly visual effects artists are typically quite underpaid and overworked. And so now it's like, sorry Billy, because Arnold Schwarzenegger is just so buff, you can't see your kids this weekend. Get working on that muscle system though. But yeah, in addition to this, speaking of adding sheer amounts of detail to bring the character to life, this brings me to the number one key of all of this, and that is how they made the character's eyes. As with the eyes being the window to the soul, and therefore where most of our attention flows when you're looking at someone, you know, you're looking at mine right now, I know, they're beautiful. Any imperfection in the eyes that belong to a CGI character is just the first thing that's immediately sniffed out somewhere deep in our primal brain. And so that's probably why, in this film, Arnold's eyes were crafted to a meticulous level of detail, with the visual effects team actually equating them as the primary reason as to why this Arnold left the uncanny valley. And so considering all of this, the fact that it comes down to such tiny little subtle details to make a character like this believable, and just to get him out of the uncanny valley, really shows just how much work goes into crafting a digital double like this. But yeah, to wrap this up, the cherry on top of everything was that the real Arnold Terminator, you know, the one actually played by Schwarzenegger throughout the earlier parts of the film, was also subtly digitally enhanced to make a 67-year-old Arnold look like a 50-year-old Arnold. And so this was more of a video Photoshop painting in the details kind of thing, as opposed to a full-blown CGI replacement. And whilst, yeah, to be honest, he doesn't really look like how he looked in Terminator 3 when he was actually 50, whatever they did here was very subtle, and I'm very grateful they kept it subtle, and perhaps a bit less effective, just for the sake of realism, as it makes it easier to enjoy the few moments of this film that it is actually possible to enjoy, which I'll let you know when I find them. But now, speaking of both effectiveness and subtlety, this brings us to our final CGI Arnold, which is the fantastic one from Terminator Dark Fate. Because whilst this scene may be literally one of the worst narrative choices ever, like genuinely in the behind the scenes they said the reason they killed John Connor is because he's boring and played out, from a visual effects perspective, if the Arnold from Genisys was like 99% believable, then this one here is just 100% believable, to the point where I just genuinely believe they went back in time and got the real Arnold Schwarzenegger to play this guy. And of course, whilst a lot of this quality does come down to just the general evolution of CGI technology, I think a lot of it is also due to the fact that this scene had all of the advantages that Genisys had. You know, they had the exact same body double on set, and then they also had Arnold there to provide reference on how he should move and such, but it also had none of the disadvantages that Genisys had, as rather than being shackled to mimicking a scene from Terminator 1, now the filmmakers had complete freedom to optimize this scene for photorealism. For example, this time around, Arnold is wearing sunglasses, which is almost certainly a deliberate choice to not only occlude part of his face from us and therefore help break up that uncanny valley illusion in a similar way to how Davy Jones's facial features do, but more importantly, it also just covers his eyes, meaning that the visual effects team doesn't have to worry about any of that complicated window to the soul stuff that we mentioned before.
Oh, please. I have no soul.
And then furthermore, they also actually dressed this Arnold, which was presumably done again to both lower the amount of effort needed to perfectly manifest that iconic Arnold physique, and to also occlude the amount of skin we see, and therefore reduce how much of that very slow, light penetrating skin calculations that the computer has to do. But of all of these benefits, I personally believe that the biggest is actually the fact that Arnold's entire presence in this scene is done in slow motion. Because Arnold's performance as the Terminator is something that has this very unnatural feeling to it, because he's trying to play a robot, and so he's deliberately moving in this very stiff and uncomfortable way. And so when you're trying to make your CGI character look alive and natural, but then the actor you're mimicking is trying to look unalive and unnatural, then you've suddenly got this really complicated balance that you have to strike. And so when the visual success of a CGI character comes down to a lot of these absurd subtleties in their performance, by doing this in slow motion, I think something suddenly feels just a lot more natural about that stiffness, because it's almost like your brain can just accept the stiffness as part of the slow motion rather than a flaw with the CGI. And so to wrap all of this up, what I found perhaps the most interesting about this Arnold was that whilst all the sources I read about it certainly did stress just how difficult it was, I didn't get the feeling that this was as all-encompassingly difficult as the previous two attempts were, as the vibe I got instead was that this is just more of a standardized and normal process at this point. And in fact, with all three characters here being CGI, which is just incredible by the way, they actually said that Arnold was the easiest to do of the three of them, because at this point so much research and so much work has been done towards creating him over all of these years that they actually had a really solid foundation they could start working from to make him look as good as possible. And so it's just kind of crazy to think that this fantastic result here is basically the product of over 10 years of not just CGI evolution, but also filmmaking evolution, all working together to make the perfect digital result. And so it's just such a shame that all of this work was used for this film and in this scene. But hey, you know what? If I had to say one nice thing about this scene, then I guess I'm happy to see a Terminator actually terminate their target. It's just a shame who the target was. And so I guess all in all, the real lesson learned here is that there's no bad CGI but what we make. I don't know what that means, but just remember that no matter how bad you think it can always be worse. Thank you for watching everyone, and thank you to the support of all of my Patreon subs. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I just wanted to say if you did enjoy, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. There's a bunch of extra videos on there, including videos on Terminator that I just couldn't squeeze into this one. It's literally only $1 and you get a regular shout out on the channel and loads more. And all of the support goes directly back into making these videos as good as possible. So yeah, these videos take forever to make, so if you enjoy them, it would genuinely mean the world to me if you just click the link below and check it out.